Good afternoon, everybody. Glenn Master, Chairman and President of the ISCPO, and I want to welcome everybody to our third podcast. The title is Fictitious Pickups and Strategic Theft. And for somebody like me who's been a security practitioner for well over 2 decades, I've had a lot of in-depth experience and investigation working on fictitious pickups, but as you will come to find out from this podcast, the crime has changed dramatically, and the vernacular has even changed to where now the term fictitious pickups is really behind us, and it has now evolved to more strategic theft with a lot of different multifaceted flares to it. So with that, I want to welcome our special guest. Scott Cornell is National Practitioner Leader for Transportation and Inland Marine for Travelers, and former Board Director of ISCPO. So welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me today, Glenn. I appreciate it. It's going to be fun to be here and talk about this. You know, this is a hot topic right now, and there's been a lot of changes, and I think that's I think that's an interesting way to start the conversation. That in the sense that you pointed out, we've just seen this change so much over the time that you and I have known each other, and over the time doing this. I have 29-year background in cargo theft investigations, supply chain security, things like that, and there's been a ton of change over all that time.
So Scott, again, I want to welcome you to the podcast. So if you look at the term fictitious pickups, I've obviously been doing this well over 2 decades, and some of the investigation experience that I've had really has just dealt with organized crime groups, and it really wasn't as multifaceted as it is today. And especially over the past 3 to 5 years, the environment has changed in regards to these organized groups, and really going from fictitious pickups to the new vernacular of strategic theft. Can you share with the audience a little bit about the changes that have taken place, specifically just over the past 3 to 5 years in the industry?
Yeah, I think the change in vernacular really comes from the expansion of how many different methods we've seen come into play over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, right? If we go back to 2014-ish, I remember, and I think you were there, I remember being at JJ's conference in Texas, at the Texas Cargo Theft Summit. And that was the first time that the industry started to really see a spike in identity theft, fictitious pickups. We hadn't really seen too much on the double brokering scams and those types of things yet. So we were really dealing with straight theft, fictitious pickups, and identity thefts. And I think at the time, because, maybe because it was an initial bump and we were just starting to see a rise in it, the phrase or the term fictitious pickup caught on because the industry was struggling to really point out the differences between the two, between the identity theft and the fictitious pickup. As we moved forward, I think that became clearer, and then they continued to add different methods like the double brokering scams, like ghost trucks. That was a scam that was around for just a couple of years, it came and went. But I think between that 14 and maybe 2018 period, we saw a bunch of new methods come into play, and they kind of self-defined themselves. They weren't the same. Identity theft was clearly different than fictitious pickup. And then the issues around, well, who's responsible in an identity theft versus a fictitious pickup? And so now you get into, okay, we have to define these, and we have to define them separately. And then as we saw more and more and more methods and tricks of the trade, so to speak, added by these organized crime rings come into play, we just said, okay, we have to have a better catch-all name for it, and we started to use strategic cargo theft. And I think strategic cargo theft does a good job because it encompasses all those methods. You can throw them all in there. You can define them each once you're within that category, but it takes it away from straight theft. We know it's different than straight theft, so we needed something to kind of separate those two things. We have straight theft and we have the strategic theft, and then all the different methods that fall underneath those two categories.
So it's interesting that you bring that up, because as a practitioner, I look at some of the investigations that I did 5, 10 years ago, where it was basically impersonating a legitimate trucking company, creating false bills of lading, showing up to a particular distribution center, whether that's a retailer, technology manufacturer, whatever the product was, handing that over unsuspecting to a security officer or somebody in receiving and actually stealing the load. To where just recently I had interaction with a pretty complex investigation that was coming out of Latin America. And you had mentioned the double brokerage, the ghost trucks. And this latest caper that I was involved in, it was interesting because it was so multifaceted that by the time anybody actually realized that the truck had been stolen, 14 days had passed. And even at that time, people were still unsure who were involved with the particular brokerage of this product line, that the load had actually even been stolen. And that was a lot different than from what my previous experience was with is just creating a false bill of lading. So can you share a little bit about why you think or some of the experiences you're seeing across the industry, why the criminals are changing their behavior and getting to that level?
Well, I think there's a bunch of reasons. So I think if we backtrack just a little bit, we talk about, and who would have thought, Glenn, in 2014 when we started to see the identity theft and the fictitious pickup come out, that we'd think those were the good old days. Who would have thought, right? Because they were rather simplistic, right? In an identity theft, I steal the identity. If I'm the bad guy, I steal the identity of a legitimate trucking company. I pretend to be that trucking company. The freight broker doesn't catch that during the vetting process. They hire me. I go pick up the load. They give me all the paperwork. They give me everything because they think I'm legitimate. They think I'm ABC Trucking, even though I'm just pretending to be ABC Trucking. I go pick up the load and I disappear with that load. With a fictitious pickup, the difference there is, and when what kind of became clear from that 2014 to maybe 2018 period, was that in a fictitious pickup, the freight broker didn't get tricked. The freight broker hired a legitimate trucking company, and that legitimate trucking company was going to show up at 1 o'clock on Friday to pick up the load. But somehow somebody found out about that load. They showed up at 11 o'clock on Friday. They're given the load. They disappear. The legitimate trucking company shows up at 1 o'clock to pick up the load. And now you're sitting there saying, okay, well, how did this happen? Where did we go wrong there? We hired the right carrier. We vetted the carrier properly. And at that point, it becomes, okay, did the shipper just release it to the wrong party? And then who's at fault and where's the fault? And that's where we really saw those defining lines come out, so to speak. Well, now as we sit here today, about 3 years ago, we've seen cargo theft in the United States fundamentally change. And how has that changed? Well, first of all, to your point, you said you caught a case coming out of South America. Well, that's one of the things that has been the biggest change over the last 3 or 4 years is cargo theft in the United States has become more of an international play. The industry's reported seeing cargo theft attempts from over 22 different countries. So we've gone from, when you and I first started doing cargo theft investigations, they were these small regional crews. They were based here domestically. They weren't that sophisticated. They were doing straight theft. They might do some identity theft. They might do a couple of fictitious pickups. But we kind of knew their methods. We knew the crews. We knew the members in the crews. We knew where they operated regionally, everything like that. Now we have these soup to nuts organizations. They have their own call centers. They have their own supply chain. They stand up online stores. They have more sophisticated methods. They're putting, to your point, 3 and 4 layers into those methods. So now I commit identity theft to pretend to be a legitimate trucking company. You give me that load. I then turn around and pretend to be a freight broker. I book a legitimate trucking company to pick up that load. That legitimate trucking company has no idea that they're being involved in this. They go pick up the freight. I have that trucking company deliver that freight to a cross dock so that I can begin to launder that freight on paper. I bring it in, it's listed as a load of televisions. It comes out listed as electronics. Then I take it to another cross dock or I take it to another warehouse and it goes in as electronics and it comes out as FAK, freight of all kinds. And now I'm putting it back in the supply chain. And again, when you and I were doing this 7, 8 years ago, 6 out of 10 loads stolen in the U.S. stayed in the U.S. and we had more time to recover them. As we sit here today, 6 out of 10 loads that are stolen in the U.S., they're trying to push them out of the U.S. They're trying to get them overseas. And they have a bigger supply chain to move that stolen freight. They have a bigger market to sell that freight in. And that bigger market is responsible for these huge spikes we're seeing in the numbers themselves.
You know, it's interesting that you mention the multifaceted level that this has gotten to, especially from a call center standpoint, having buyers with this recent investigation that I was part of. We were able to figure out initially that the call center potentially may have been in West Africa. The load was coming out of Latin America through Mexico, through a cross-border situation into southern Texas, with a potential buyer in Southeast Asia. And if you were to look at how a network works from that standpoint, I mean, really, it has evolved into true organized crime, hasn't it?
I think the example you give is a perfect example. Think about all those layers and how complex that investigation becomes. You know, several years ago, a load is stolen in Southern California, maybe 30 miles from the port or 30 miles from the distribution center. It's stolen at the truck stop when the driver goes in to take a break, comes out, load's gone. That's not that complex. That's not, back then it was, a rush to action. You had to spin up really quick and you had to respond quickly before the freight disappeared, before it became unrecoverable, but it wasn't that complex. When you think about what you just walked through, or you think about, one of the big problems that we're seeing in the industry right now is these larger organized crime rings are buying MC numbers by the thousands. And so they're in essence a legitimate trucking company, but they're using that legitimacy to go out, get booked on freight, and steal freight. Who saw that coming? Right? That started between 2 and 3 years ago. We saw that it was starting, myself, you, other experts, we saw that they were starting to do that. We came to the industry and said, hey, this isn't good. They're going to use this to steal. And as we sit here today, they're using it to steal freight, and it makes it much harder to pick them out from a company that isn't stealing, that is just doing an honest day's work and moving freight. And you have the rings that are picking up a load of 20 pallets, removing 19 pallets, redoing the paperwork to say that it's a 1 pallet load. That paperwork has a new seal on it. They put that new seal on the trailer. It gets delivered to the consignee. The consignee looks at the paperwork. The paperwork says 1 pallet load. It has the new trailer number on it. It has the new seal number on it. And it gets checked in. And it's not, and they'll do that 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 times. The same group, targeting the same loads from the same distribution center to the same consignee. They'll do that over and over and over again until somebody suddenly realizes, hey, we're short on 30 loads. And the complexity behind that is not what the industry has traditionally seen over all the time that you and I, experts like you and I have been involved in.
Which brings up my next question, and obviously a lot of our viewers are going to be from around the world, and you may have a practitioner that is in a far-reaching part of the country who has several loads compromised, and they don't necessarily know where to turn. I mean, if you look at back in the day, domestically, we had a very strong network, and that's one of the reasons, obviously, was the genesis of the ISCPO, specifically from a networking standpoint. But now, you've got this freight touching so many different parties, going cross-border, going across oceans now. So from an investigation standpoint for both private sector and public sector, where do you foresee this going on being able to successfully work these investigations now that there are so many different entities in both law enforcement and private sector across different countries involved?
I think it's a great question, and I think it comes back to a conversation that I've been having a lot of lately, which is, several decades ago, we saw safety become part of the culture of the supply chain several decades ago. And so now, anytime you're talking about the supply chain, you're talking about some aspect of safety, whether it's new technology, whether it's good practices, it's risk managers that are in-house, it's risk managers that are third party that you hire and bring in. It's services, it's equipment that you can buy that has safety integrated into it. Well, I think the supply chain has to, at this point, has to move towards that same type of culture towards theft prevention and security. I think, there's always been aspects of security that have been brought into the supply chain. But I think it has to be part of the culture of the way the supply chain operates, soup to nuts. Now, I think from an investigative standpoint, you just have to adapt. I think investigators have to adapt, and we're seeing that. I mean, you and I know a lot of the same people and a lot of the same professional investigators in this industry, and we're certainly seeing them adapt. And there's no, I don't see any slowing in that. I don't see that the investigators are behind the times on that. I think all the best investigators, all the experts, we all talk pretty regularly. It's a small circle, you know that. I think we're all on top of the new methods. I think we're all on top of how you have to follow up and investigate those methods. But I think when it gets global, to your point, there has to be a better network, global network, right? Because most of the investigators here are investigating here domestically, or maybe getting into Mexico, maybe getting into Canada, but they're not catching a lot of cases, unless they're an internal operator like you are, right? You operate internally at your company and you're responsible soup to nuts globally for it. So someone like yourself in another company or similar companies is going to have that. But when you look at a lot of the investigators, they're used to North America or maybe North America and South America. And now, to your point, you have something coming from South America through Mexico into the US, going over to, maybe Asia, and there's ties to Africa or something like that. Now you have to learn, the network has to be bigger. Communication has to be bigger. I think organizations like ISCPO, TAPA, you name it, different organizations like that help bring some of that together and tie some of that together. But I think that has to become more natural. I think that has to, and that'll evolve, and I think it'll evolve rather quickly. But I do think it has to become part of just the overall culture of the way the supply chain works.
No, you're 100% correct, and I think the evolution is going to come specifically out of necessity. And the other good point that you made is how technology is evolving. I mean, if you look at, we have two preferred vendors, Verkada and 7P. Verkada specifically in the CCTV access control space. 7P is in the GPS space. 5 years ago, it would be unheard of for a solution provider to come to a practitioner and specifically ask them, especially from an engineering standpoint, and want to do a survey into how we're using the equipment, or even more specifically asking the practitioner what trends are taking place throughout the industry. We've got a product, we've got an application, this is what it does, here you go, either you want it or you don't want it. I think where we're seeing the evolution, especially with those two preferred vendors, is they're coming to trade shows, they're participating in the events, they're hearing experts like yourself talk about where this technology can be leveraged, and they're going back and evaluating the technology and the application of how can it improve for the greater good of the industry. Whether it be a camera application, whether it be an access control application for investigation, or a preventive action such as GPS technology, which is evolving on a continuous basis. So that's another thing I'm really seeing, obviously, from the investigation standpoint, progressive change. But I'm also seeing from the solution providers that they're coming to practitioners, they're coming to experts, and really wanting to participate in the industry as a whole to understand what are the challenges and how can we change our product to fit the needs of the practitioner.
And I think that's great, isn't it? And I agree with you. I think that we're seeing that first of all, we're seeing a lot of new solutions come into the industry, right? Specifically around how to vet your carriers, how to verify that the people that you're doing business with are who you think they are. So we're seeing a lot of those solutions, and it comes out of necessity, just like you said. So the industry's seeing, a bunch of new solutions come in, but it's also great that the solutions that have existed, if I use 7P as an example, I speak to them regularly. We see them at all the conferences, but I speak to them regularly. Certainly, we're very familiar with their tracking devices. And I think it's great that they are realizing that, hey, this is all changing, just like the rest of us are. And our product can't be flat-footed. Our product has to evolve with that. How can we integrate that? And listen, we're dating ourselves and we can joke about it, but you and I both know when tracking devices first came out, they were the size of a brick, they were $3,000, and they were terrible. They were terrible, right? And the fact that we can sit here today and say that you can get a single-use tracking device for $50 that will fit in a pillbox is fantastic. So we've seen that evolution over time, right? But it's great to see that the regular solution providers that we have come to know in the industry and are kind of staples of the industry are not just sitting on their resting on their laurels. They are saying, we realize our product has to adapt because cargo depth is changing. How can we adapt that product and make it as applicable today as it was 5 years ago? And I think that's great. And I think we're going to continue to see that from the best companies. The best companies will separate themselves in that way.
No, and I appreciate it, and we're obviously coming to the end of this podcast, but I want to thank you very much for your time and your consideration into this evolving criminal activity. It's amazing if you look back at when we first started and how we started investigating this, that if you were to look at the multifaceted operations that now have evolved into global criminal organizations, and cargo theft is a multi-billion-dollar crime, right? And it's really going to take all of us in the industry, both security practitioners, law enforcement, both domestically here in the United States and internationally, to come together, share ideas, talk openly and transparent about the challenges everybody is facing, because that ultimately is how we're going to solve this. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think you and I would both agree that with the complexity we're seeing around the methods, prevention is going to be more important than ever. Certainly the investigative techniques have to evolve with it, but the prevention is just so much more important because of the complexity. So I think that, and I think, having this networking and this type of thing is fantastic. And I really appreciate you bringing me on today. It's a great conversation. I love talking about this. At least I would say it's going to remain ever challenging. I don't see it slowing down anytime soon.
Will keep us all gainfully employed for a while.
Right.
Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to podcast number 3 of ISCPO. We've got some great upcoming events that are going to be taking place in Burbank, California, London, UK, and also Toronto for the remainder of 2024. Be on the lookout on ISCPO's website for these upcoming events and the opportunity to meet board directors, meet other individuals in the industry, and it's a great networking opportunity as well. Thank you very much, and thank you again, Scott, for joining us.
Thanks, Glenn. Happy to be here.